Good morning. Today we're going to take on the marsh and how you would teach the marsh to students. So for this activity, you're going to want a handful of supplies. The first would be nets for each of the kids. Another would be a bucket. And if you have available the identification keys and small magnifying boxes and a paintbrush if you have that available. So the first thing you want to do as students is you want to help them understand where in the pond to be dipping. So you want to set your guidelines as to where kids should be. I often say they need to be spread out along the entire boardwalk so it doesn't actually sink underneath them. And I try to tell them to work in partners or groups of 3. Partners usually work the best because we always know with a group of 3, one person always gets left out. The next thing you want to talk about is the fact that this is a marsh, and I'll give you some of the background later in this video as to what this marsh is actually going through. We call that succession, but I'll talk more about that in a later video. And then you want to talk a little bit about the areas, the surface, the middle, the bottom, and then closer to the grasses, and making sure students are looking in all 3 of those locations so that they're finding different types of insects. You also want to remind them that when they bring up their net, they want to look carefully as the water is escaping for anything that's moving, because that is the best way to find these insects. I remind them that they're not fluorescent pink and they're not going to jump out at them and say, "Here I am." They actually have to use their eyes. I tell them that the colors they're looking for are green, browns, blacks, and sometimes even kind of transparent or white, and that they have to look really carefully for things that are wiggling. And not to just assume on their first dip that there's nothing in there. They actually want to look very carefully to see if there's something that looks a little bit different than dirt or mud. The next thing you probably want to remind kids is that we have floating docks out here so they don't freak out as soon as they walk on the dock and it starts to move on them. The next thing you want to do is to make sure you're filling up the bucket with water. I always encourage you to fill it up with just a little bit of water, making sure you don't add a lot of debris to it, because if you've got a lot of mud and leaves and dirt in here, it's very difficult to find the insects again after you are done. So I usually find the deepest or most open spot to fill up the bucket. So it would look something like this, where you can actually find your insects again. And then I try to leave them in the center so that kids aren't tripping on them as they are walking around the boardwalk. Usually if you put one here and kind of one in the middle of the rest of the boardwalk, that's usually satisfactory for the students to put them all in one so that they're not all every which way and they're not trying to all like trip over the buckets and spilling everything every which way. So a good strategy when students are working in an area like this is they can dip in the open water and pull it up. Oh wow, got some tadpoles. Cool. And then the hard part is actually getting these things out. That's why I recommend a paintbrush, which I didn't bring with me today. So we'll just carefully put one in here. Maybe we'll put 2 in here. And then I tell kids if they need to empty out their net again, it's just to go backwards through the water. It helps empty the net very well. Try to remind them not to dump it on the dock. It makes the dock really messy. But more importantly, if there are insects in there that you didn't see, it makes it very difficult for them to survive. Once they dip in the open water, you can also encourage them to dip up against the grasses. It's a little bit harder, so they have to get a little further under the water and pull them up against the grasses. They can also go a little further out in what they're catching so that they can find maybe something a little different. I always try to encourage them, if they are to work in pairs, to do a dip and then take a good look and then have the partner take a dip so that one person's not standing around the entire time bored, and that way both people are getting some chance to actually dip in the wetland. So the final thing that I always do with students is before they release, I make sure they say thank you to all of these wonderful macroinvertebrates for spending some time with us.
Thank you for spending time with us.
And then sending it back into the water gently. So they're not pouring them from the top. They're gently setting it in and then pouring it out. And then make sure that at the end you rinse out the bucket as best as you can so that there are no insects left in it still. Thank you, Eve.
You're welcome.
So we've already shown you how to do the Marsh study with your strainers and the buckets in the water. But I wanted to take a closer look at some of the insects, or what we call macroinvertebrates, that you might find in the marsh. The easiest way to start to learn your different macroinvertebrates is to take a look at the pond key that is in the green bucket. This was produced by, I believe, the UW Extension. There are a few mistakes on here. There should be a dragonfly nymph and not larva, which I believe all of the sheets at Camp Gray have already been changed. But in case you come across them, you will know that there are a couple mistakes. And you can see that down here on the bottom where it says dragonfly larva. It's actually a dragonfly nymph, and I'll explain the difference in just a few minutes. So one of the most common macroinvertebrates that you will find in the marsh or a wetland are called dragonfly nymphs. Most adults can identify a dragonfly, as can kids. They're very easy to identify when they're flying around as an adult, but in the water or in the wetlands, students often think they look a little bit like a dragon, which is probably where their name came from. These insects come in a variety of different colors. They range anywhere from green and browns and different patterns, very large to very small. And that's because the dragonfly nymph can live inside the wetlands for a few years before going through metamorphosis and becoming an adult. The really cool thing about the dragonfly nymph is you will see its beginning wings on its ends here, and they also have the ability to camouflage themselves. The green coloration will help them blend into the grasses of the marsh, and we also have our browns, which will camouflage themselves into the mud or the debris of the pond. The other really cool thing, depending on the species of dragonfly nymph, you will find that many of them will have little tiny hairs all over their body. And that is so that if a predator is looking for them, they will blend into the pond muck a little bit better. Another thing I wanted to show you is the dragonfly doesn't just camouflage itself. It actually has a really unique way of moving through the water. And this is a quick video showing you how a dragonfly actually moves. They will actually take a mouthful of water in the front and they will spit it out the back side of them to help propel them through the water. And you can see that here in the back of the video of the water being propelled out of the dragonfly. Another really cool feature about dragonflies is that they have what's called labium, L-A-B-I-U-M, or the part of their mouth that actually drops down and allows the mouth to come out and grab its prey. And it's a really fascinating thing to watch. And if ever you see me up at Camp Gray and we're at the marsh, ask me to show you with an actual live dragonfly that you can actually pull apart the jaw so you can actually see what this does. But since I'm not there and it's difficult to get this on video, and I will try when I'm up at Camp Gray, but this is a quick video that was produced by National Geographic of the dragonfly and how they are able to lower the labium out to capture or help capture an insect that they're going to eat, and then they use it a little bit like a plate to help them actually eat it. It's extremely fascinating, and all the Onodata species do this, including damselflies, which is the next macroinvertebrate that we will be talking about.
It's a larva eat larva world down here. Did you see that? Let's slow it down. The nymph has a killer whip called a labium. Remind you of this creepy thing? For this skimmer nymph, it's shaped like a spork. Only dragonfly and damselfly nymphs have this special lip. This kind of dragonfly nymph, a donor, has an extra surprise. There's a pair of pincers right at the end. It all happens in a fraction of a second. Think of the lip as a knife, fork, and plate all rolled into one. When the meal is over, it folds up neatly, ready for the next occasion.
The next really important thing to understand in regards to dragonflies and many of the other macroinvertebrates in the pond, or even some of our amphibians in the pond, is the difference in what we call metamorphosis. There are two types of metamorphosis. One called complete metamorphosis, which is what most people know, and another one called incomplete metamorphosis. And the reason I mentioned earlier that dragonflies are called dragonfly nymphs is that they do not go through a complete metamorphosis. So let's talk about what metamorphosis is, and we'll specifically look at complete metamorphosis to start with. One that you're all familiar with are butterflies and perhaps ladybugs. And the cycle for complete metamorphosis is that all of the animals that go through complete metamorphosis start out as eggs. And once those eggs hatch out, they form a larva stage, which is a stage in which the animal is eating a lot to grow. They might stay in this larva stage for a few different moltings, it's called, where they will eat for a period of time and grow, split their exoskeleton. Exoskeleton means they're outside of their skeleton. And they'll eat maybe more, and they might go through this cycle 3 or 4 times. When it's large enough, it will then transform into a pupa stage. A pupa stage is an unmoving stage where the animal is going through their complete metamorphosis. And then finally they turn into their adult counterpart. So in the butterfly cycle, you also will know that they have eggs, but the larva stage is what we call a caterpillar, the pupa stage is what we call the chrysalis stage, and the adult is what we call a butterfly. So animals that go through this would be things like the ladybugs and butterflies and frogs, although they don't do a larva and a pupa stage, they do a tadpole stage. So I guess we can't really call that complete metamorphosis. But there are some insects that do not go through complete metamorphosis, and what that's called is incomplete metamorphosis. And in this case, they have their eggs like normal, but this time they hatch out into a nymph stage. And this nymph stage may last for a few weeks, or it might even last for a few years, where the insect continually eats and then molts its exoskeleton, eats more and continues to grow, and continually shedding their exoskeleton when it gets too small, until it is old enough and large enough to become an adult. And when that happens, they will then usually shed their exoskeleton one last time, and they will be an adult in the back. So in the dragonfly case, what happens is the dragonfly stays in this nymph stage, and when it's ready, it will climb up a tall piece of grass, split that exoskeleton, which is what you see here. That's just its outside skeleton, a little bit like our bones, except it's on the outside instead of the inside like ours. We call ours, by the way, an endoskeleton. And the dragonfly will then have its wings dry out and then fly away as an adult. Damselfly nymphs. They also belong to the family Odonata. They're very easy to tell the difference in the water. Dragonflies look a little bit larger and bulkier, and damselflies are small and needle-like. An identification for them is they have these 3 tails that are at the back of their body. They use these as gills, so they move them around in the water, and that's what allows the damselfly to breathe. They also have their beginning wings on their back. Now the question is, what do they look like as an adult? Most people mistake damselflies and dragonflies to be the same, but they are not. Let me show you.
So dragonflies are these, but most of us have seen damselflies and identify them as dragonflies. So how do you tell the difference? Often, but not always, our dragonflies are a little bit thicker than our damselflies that are a little bit thinner like this. But the best way to identify the difference is that when the dragonflies land, they lay their wings outstretched, and damselflies, when they land, leave their wings out in the back of them, folded up. So you can see here the damselfly has its wings back, whereas the dragonfly has them outright. And so that's probably the easiest way to tell the difference between the two. Another really cool insect of the wetland is the giant water bug. I call these the top predator of the wetlands. They're super cool. They range anywhere from a couple centimeters to a couple inches long. And they are fierce predators in the pond. They have been known to go after frogs, salamanders, toads, tadpoles, fish. There's even been a documented case of a giant water bug going after swans, which you know is a very large bird. There are examples of water bugs, giant water bugs, trying to eat the toes off of people. They're not obviously going to hurt you, but they do have some really cool things. So what happens with these is they have these large jaws up here in the front that will capture their prey, and then these little, what they call a beak, gets injected into their animal, and it turns them basically to soup that they can then drink out. Another cool thing about the giant water bug is it breathes by two tubes in the back called tubules. And the giant water bug will perch itself in the water, this portion facing down, so that it can find the prey that it's going to eat. And these two things sticking up out of the top of the water that they use a little bit like a snorkel. And so they use those to breathe. Another really cool thing about the giant water bug is that the female will lay its eggs on the back of the male, and the male will carry them around until they're a little bit older, and eventually the giant water bugs will hatch out of the back of these. And I have actually caught a giant water bug with eggs, and I've also caught a giant water bug where these eggs were all little tiny baby giant water bugs that were still attached to dad and hadn't swam off yet. But a significant predator to the wetlands. Another one very similar and in the same family is what we call the water scorpion. These are the ones that I would see up at Camp Gray. I don't see them very often, so when I do, it gets very exciting. These would be its pinchers that they use to capture its prey. These are the tubules that they use to breathe out of the water. And then obviously they camouflage themselves really well by looking like grass in the water. This one looks a little bit more like a giant water bug, but you can see the two tubules are sticking outright versus being within the body. And that's the best way to identify the difference. The next macroinvertebrate we're going to talk about is the crawling water beetle. The reason we call it a beetle is it fits into the category of our beetles in the insect category. Beetles have a hard shield on the outside of their body, kind of like armor. And when they are ready to fly, they actually pull these two pieces aside and the wings come from underneath. And crawling water beetles can leave the water. One of the really cool things about crawling water beetles is they move around the water very quickly. They come in a variety of colors of orangish like this, or light yellow, or kind of a darker tan to blend in a little bit better. And while the crawling water beetle is in the water, it will actually come up to the surface of the water, grab an air bubble, and bring it back underneath the water. They use it as their way to breathe, a little bit like a scuba tank. And when you're working with students, you can actually see this little tiny air bubble at the back of its tail. Crawling water beetles are perfect to put in those little magnifying boxes because they're really small and they move very quickly, and so they're harder to see. By putting them in the boxes, it makes it a little easier. And students can actually look in at those magnified insects and see that little tiny air bubble at the back of their tail. One of my favorite insects to talk about is the caddisfly larva. The caddisfly larvae are what we call an indicator species. And what that means is when you find a caddisfly in a wetland, you know that the wetland's health is very, very clean because caddisflies do not like polluted water and they die off very quickly. I had never seen a caddisfly larva before until I came to Camp Gray. We don't often catch them in your marsh, but you can see them in the stream. If you pick up many of the rocks, you will see them underneath on the bottom of the rocks. And they are super duper cool animals to take a look at. And the reason they are so incredibly cool is that they create their own home. And they create their home out of the objects that are near to them in the stream or the wetland. Now granted, there are many different species of caddisfly larvae, and many of the species will use very specific things like leaves from trees or needles from coniferous trees or rocks from the bottom. Some will even use junk that they find in the wetland and create their really cool homes. So here are a couple examples. Here's a caddisfly larva inside its home of probably leaves that it built. And this is another caddisfly who has produced a home out of the small little pebbles at the bottom of the wetland that it's living in. Caddisflies, when you find them, are often together and they often are pointed the same direction in the wetland. You'll notice that most of them are all coming out the top here, and that's because they point themselves based on the direction of the stream. And usually they will be pointed upstream so that they can gather the debris and other nutrients as the water is coming down for themselves to eat. Caddisfly larvae will turn into the adult, which looks like this. I know most of us probably have seen this and had no idea that this was a caddisfly. Another insect that you will most likely catch in the marsh are what we call backswimmers and water boatmen. They are sometimes very difficult to tell the difference, and I will try to share with you the difference that I have noticed very easily. Backswimmers, you will often see their red eyes that they have on the bottom, and they look like they are swimming on their back. So it looks like they're actually swimming, and it looks like they're doing the back swim. That's why they're called backswimmers. And this portion right here will actually be at the surface of the water, and they will use these legs to kind of pull themselves around. The other cool thing that you will sometimes notice is they also use air bubbles to help them breathe as well. Water boatmen, on the other hand, will have their eyes kind of on the bottom, and they will look a little bit darker, and their legs are on the bottom. And these very much look like they're rowing a boat, thus why they are called water boatmen. They will also usually have a very silver bottom, which is the air bubble that it has captured, a very large one that it uses as a scuba tank. So the biggest difference between our backswimmer and the water boatman, they both look like they're rowing a boat or swimming in the water. Backswimmers will have their feet on the top, water boatmen will have them on the bottom. But they're very distinctively different. If you ever see these two, you will see that the water boatman really looks like they're rowing a boat, and the backswimmer really looks like it's doing the backswim. Another macroinvertebrate you might find in the marsh, or I often find them in the stream as well, are things called a scud. Some people mistake these as crayfish. They are not. They are very small. They would be like half the size of my little fingernails. They're very tiny. They are kind of transparent in color or white. They have a very distinctive way of moving in the water. It almost looks like they bring their tail up and down as they swim, and they swim relatively quickly. But you can actually see them if you're observant, or when you catch them, they try to move in the water, and so it looks like they're jumping around a net. Another insect that is another indicator species is the mayfly. The mayfly nymphs are ones that also only live in very healthy, clean water systems. Many people mistake them as damselfly nymphs because of the three tails in the back, and you can see I put an example here of both of them. On the right is the damselfly nymph, on the left is the mayfly nymph. And you can see that they have the three different tails. The best identification between the two is that the mayflies have all these little tiny hairy gills on its side, and the damselfly does not. The mayfly uses these gills to actually breathe, whereas the dragonfly uses its 3 tails to breathe. Outside of the water, mayflies are very distinctively different than the damselfly. So here's the nymph, and when it becomes an adult, this is what the mayfly looks like. The cool thing about mayflies, the mayflies live most of their life in the water. As an adult, they live literally for a day. The mayfly adult doesn't even actually have a mouth. So this particular insect never eats. It literally mates and it dies. Sometimes mayflies, like if you go by Lake Michigan or some of our other Great Lakes, there will actually be a season in time where all of the mayflies are all hatching out at the same time, and there will be swarms of these by the light poles or near the water. There's even been reports many times of there being so many mayflies that the roads become slick like ice. And I've even heard of warnings going out for mayfly warnings on the Weather Channel for the roads because they become as slick as the ice here in Wisconsin in the wintertime. So fascinating thing, they only live for about 24 hours. They don't even have a mouth part to eat. They literally mate and die. So the majority of their lifetime is in the nymph stage. Another, actually arachnid, it doesn't actually fit in the insect category, that some students will come across is the fishing spider. They're relatively large. They range in color from grays and browns, and they usually sit on top of the surface of the water on the plants, and they are looking for fish and tadpoles and other insects to eat. They actually don't go under the water, so if a child catches them, just be careful when you put them back that you don't dump them into the water. You can put them on some of the debris near the water for them to continue their fishing. Water striders are our next macroinvertebrate or insect. They are also extremely fascinating. I have seen them both at the marsh and at the stream, and the ones at the stream are actually quite large, and you often see them kind of in the sides of the stream as we're moving through. The reason these water striders are so cool is that they actually live at the surface of the water, so they're very easy to see skittering around the top. And the reason that they're able to stay on top of the water is that water molecules themselves create tension and a very delicate membrane at the top. We call that surface tension. And the water striders walk on that membrane. Our next one is one that we all love so much here in Wisconsin, which are mosquito larvae and mosquito pupa. As you can tell, or hopefully you can tell at this point, is that mosquitoes go through complete metamorphosis with an egg, larva, and pupa / adult stage. And mosquitoes often will start out the beginning of their life also in water, usually very stagnant water. The mosquitoes will lay their eggs in any water across the land. It could be in a tire or it could be in a wetland. And the mosquito larvae start, and they're actually at the surface of the water because they also use their tails for breathing out of the surface. And then they go into this pupa stage, which is really not a moving stage, although they kind of bounce around a little bit if you catch them. And then they hatch out into the adult stage, and this happens very quickly. And also provides a lot of food for other animals. And as much as we hate them, they are part of our food web. Our next animals are more of our beetles. This is called the predaceous water beetle. I wanted to point this one out because although I haven't caught many of them, I do see them up at Camp Gray. But what I actually catch more of is its larva stage, which is this. And a lot of people mistake them for hellgrammites or Dobson fly larvae, but they're very distinctively different. And if you look at the key, you will see that subtle difference. And they're quite large, and they look a little bit more like a worm. Another one that I don't see very often up at Camp Gray, but they're certainly super cool, are the whirligig beetles. Whirligig beetles look like they're doing kind of this dance in the water. They have a very silvery bottom, which is also their air supply, where they run up to the surface of the water, grab an air bubble, and bring it under, and use it like a scuba tank. And the whirligig beetle has this really cool pattern on the surface of the water, which I will share with you. The next animal we're going to talk about is actually an amphibian. You'd be surprised at how many people think tadpoles are fish and that frogs are actually reptiles belonging to the same family as snakes. They are not. They are very unique. You will also hear a lot of people talk about amphibians, meaning that they live in water. And I think people mistakenly don't understand that the tadpoles start in the water and they have gills that allow them to breathe in the water. And then they go through a metamorphosis to become an adult, and then they live on land. And although we do find frogs in the water, they cannot actually breathe in the water. They're actually breathing the oxygen. And I think that over the years, I think it's gotten disappearing a little bit more, but there's a myth in science that amphibia or amphibians means water and that they live in the water, which is not the case. So when students find tadpoles or frogs, I'm also very strict about what I allow them to do. Because frogs are a declining species in our world. They are what we call the canary in the coal mine. They are the first species that are becoming endangered due to the pollution and the climate change in our country and our world. There are many examples of frogs across the world that are becoming extinct, specific species. There are also many examples of frogs that have some type of mutation to them due to the pollution and the environment in which they're living. This summer I found a frog that didn't even have two of its legs. It had a front leg and a back leg, but was missing the other two, and it was not from injury. They were never actually there. So I'm very careful with students about the frogs. If they actually catch an adult frog, I will allow them to take a look at it, but then I make sure that once the students have seen it, I put it back immediately so it doesn't sit in the container for a long period of time. In terms of tadpoles, they do live in the water. They're really cool. They act more like a fish, having gills and a tail. And over time, which might be in 1 year, or it might be over several years. It usually depends on the size of the frog. Our smaller frogs, like the chorus frogs and the spring peepers, will often go through metamorphosis within a very short period of time, a month or two. Whereas our big bullfrogs, their tadpoles may live in the water for a few years. Tadpoles will eat almost anything in the pond that it can actually find, so it might be eating plants or might be eating smaller insects. As the tadpole gets larger, it will start to grow legs and then arms, and over time their tail starts to shrink. And I know another wives' tale about tadpoles is that they fall off or that the animal actually eats it. Both of those are actually not the case. The tadpole's tail starts to shrinking. It gets reabsorbed by the body into its bloodstream as food. Not the type of food you actually eat, but it just gets reabsorbed into its blood supply to give it to change the gills to the lungs and to grow feet. The other really interesting thing, and I may have already said this already, so I apologize, is that frogs and tadpoles breathe through their skin. That's why they are the canary in the coal mine, is they're breathing in all of that pollution. And so when you touch a frog, if you have any remnants of shampoo or soap or insect repellent or sunscreen or perfume or anything else that we put on our hand, and you pick up that frog, it will live for many hours, but there is more likely the case that when you put it back in the pond, it will eventually die due to those chemicals being breathed into its body. So I do not allow students to pick up frogs. If they catch them in their net, we can carefully set them in the bucket to look at, or I ask them just to release them right away so that they're not touching the frogs. The same with the tadpoles. I do leave them in the bucket. They're a little easier to keep, but I don't actually touch them. I don't allow the kids to touch them. We use just our eyes.